Exactly 30 years ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche was deeply concerned that the transatlantic relationship was in a profound crisis. People may remember at that time you had the whole battle over the deployment of the Pershing missiles in Europe. There was great concern about the danger of a situation escalating out of control, leading to a potential world war, potentially a disastrous thermonuclear war. And it was in that context and in a period of a certain bitterness back and forth between the United States and Europe that Helga took up the task of founding the Schiller Institute in order to create the historic and cultural foundations for a revival of transatlantic cooperation around the great principles of liberty and justice that were the cornerstone of all of the writings of the great poet of freedom, Friedrich Schiller. So here we are now, again, unfortunately, facing a grave global crisis. The threat of war, even thermonuclear war, again, is looming very large. And it's in that context that we're convening this conference today, both to celebrate 30 years of extraordinarily important work by the Schiller Institute, and to also once again issue a clarion cry about the necessity for global cooperation to prevent an outbreak of another potentially needless and devastating war. So Helga really needs no further introduction. She's the founder of the Schiller Institute. She's the wife of American statesman Lyndon LaRouche. And so I want to present Helga to give the opening keynote presentation for this conference.
Well, you have come here to discuss on this conference how to create a world without war, and that seems to be a very unlikely position given the current state of the world. But before I go into the discussion why I still have a profound optimism that we can accomplish this goal, let me just reference a couple of ideas which went into the founding of the Schiller Institute 30 years ago. As Jeff mentioned, it was the period of heightened war danger. People were talking about the possibility that the middle-range missiles, the Pershing II and the SS-20, who were only in a minute distance from each other in Central Europe, that you could have an accidental launch of only one missile, and in that case, the entire arsenal would have been fired by the opponent because the time was too short. And a lot of people were talking about that we were on the verge of World War III, and I think people were much more aware than they are even today, even so we are at a hair trigger of the potential extinction of civilization. The reason why I gave the effort to have a completely different conception of relations among nations to each other, the name Schiller, is because, and I want to say this because I want to encourage people to, go to the library or to the internet and read Schiller, because the reason why I gave this effort his name is because he has, to my knowledge, the most beautiful image of man. He was convinced, and he is convinced because he's immortal, that every human being has the potential to become a beautiful soul, that every human being has the potential to become a genius, and that eventually mankind will arrive at that condition where all the people born will be able to unfold all the potential which they have. And his ideas were sort of the red thread in my life from early school on. And when I thought how to create a new era of civilization, I could not think of a better synonym than him. Now, the idea of the Schiller Institute was that foreign policy should no longer be based on coups, on subversion, on sabotage, on murder, which unfortunately dominates much of foreign policy in the world today, but that that each nation should refer to the other one on the highest level of their best cultural and scientific achievement. So when you're talking with the United States, you should not think about slavery and the Vietnam War and many other things, but you should think about Benjamin Franklin, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy. And that should be the image of America. In the same way, when you're talking about Germany, you should not reduce it to the 12 years of Nazi terror, but you should think about all the great thinkers and poets and composers Germany has produced, the classical culture and scientific contribution. So the Schiller Institute was founded on that idea on the 3rd and 4th of July, 30 years ago in Arlington, and then 2 months later in Wiesbaden in Germany. And in the Arlington founding conference, we had quite an audience of 1,200 people from 50 nations who all came marching in with their flag. Their national anthem was being played. And we decided that we would work relentlessly on the idea, now comes the Schiller time, that we are to create a time where the ideas of Friedrich Schiller would dominate the world. And in the beginning, it was meant to be a German-American effort, but it became very clear that the relationship between Europe and the United States was in a terrible shape. And even, with the so-called Third World, it was even worse. So it quickly became an international effort. And since then, we have really had hundreds of conferences worldwide. We worked on development plans for the whole world, for Africa, for Latin America, an oasis plan for the Middle East, a 40-year development program for India, where we worked with Indira Gandhi together, a 50-year Pacific Basin plan. And after 1989, after the German Berlin Wall came down, we had the idea of uniting Europe and Asia through the so-called Eurasian land bridge, through infrastructure corridors. And in the meantime, since the last 25 years, we have enlarged that to the World Land Bridge, meaning a real in-depth development of all parts of the world. And that is still absolutely the concept for a peace order for the 21st century. Now, obviously, this is not the condition of the world right now. So I want to go into the question, how did we come 69 years after the end of World War II to the point where we are at the verge of World War III, which, if it occurs, would be by the very nature of things a thermonuclear war and therefore lead to the extinction of civilization. So we also basically have the reason is that when we had this idea of the Eurasian land bridge in 1989, and especially when we extended it after the collapse of the Soviet Union, why was this rejected? Well, the unfortunate historical coincidence was that at that time you had Margaret Thatcher being the Prime Minister of the British Empire, and in the United States you had the neocons. And rather than using the opportunity of the vanishing of communism to create such a new peace order, they decided to go for the so-called New America Century Doctrine, which was really a prescription for an Anglo-American dominated world empire. Now, the first objective of these people was to reduce Russia from a former Soviet superpower to a third world raw material producing country. And the means by which they accomplished that was to apply the so-called shock therapy, by which, for example, the Russian industrial capacities were reduced to 30% from 91 to 94. The second main objective was to eliminate Russia as a world potential competitor on the world market. They went after the second superpower had vanished for what is called globalization or unrestrained globalization, which meant the complete deregulation of the financial system, create cheap labor markets, turn the whole world economy into a casino economy protected by private security firms. It turned into what my late friend J.C. Kapoor, a great Indian philosopher, called the armored protected capitalism. Then they decided to go for regime change against all countries which would not submit to this new world empire. This was the basic reason for the first Iraq war in 91, conducted by Bush Sr. Then you had 8 years of the Clinton administration, which was sort of a mixed form, a little bit imperial, a little bit more Republican. But then, after that, they went into the idea to eliminate all sovereign nation states who would be regarded as an obstacle to this control of the world empire. And regime change started, and it happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. They attempted it in Syria. They did accomplish it in Ukraine for the time being. And for Europe, they decided to turn the European Union into the regional expression of this empire. It was demanded from Chancellor Kohl to give up the D-Mark, to establish the European Monetary Union as the price for the German unification, especially with the aim to prevent Germany from developing strong ties with Russia, which it had historically many times. Then they transformed the EU from the Maastricht Treaty from 91 into an empire. The criteria for the European Monetary Union, the Stability Pact, were agreed upon, which turned the EU into essentially an instrument in the interest of the banks. In 1999, the monetary version of the EU was introduced, and in 2002, the euro as a cash currency. Then, in the meantime, on the 4th of November in 1999, you had the repeal of Glass-Steagall in the United States, which was the starting point for the complete deregulation of the financial system. And at the same time, these forces geared up the final conceptual underpinnings for the empire. Extremely important, second slide, please. This extremely important was the speech of Tony Blair in 1999 in Chicago, where he declared de facto the post-Westphalian order, the basis of international law, for finished and to be replaced by so-called humanitarian interventions worldwide, which in the United States led to the right to protect. Now, the Blair Doctrine immediately started to go into a complete confrontation with the Putin Doctrine. Putin, who said that international law must be respected, that the UN Charter is to be upheld, that the national sovereignty of every country cannot be violated, as compared to Blair, who said, no, we can find pretexts to intervene militarily around the globe. So, again, they basically decided to go into regime change against all nations who would not submit. And basically the EU was turned into a total empire. And if you look at the condition of the EU today, which is committing genocide against the people of Southern Europe, you can see that nothing of the words which they use has any truth in it. Now, concerning especially the countries of the former Soviet Union, they decided to develop colored revolutions. Now, colored revolutions is a synonym for a whole variety of modes of regime change. It's an undeclared warfare, but it is war with a different characteristic appropriate to each country. Now, what I'm saying now will probably be surprising for most people, but my husband, Mr. LaRouche, recently said that the 9/11 in the United States was a form of colored revolution because it turned the American Republic, which had already some problems before, but it did turn it into an instrument of empire. And to turn the United States into the military arm of this, or into the muscle with the British having the brains, was sort of the precondition for the rest of the regime changes to succeed. Now, under the Clinton administration, the United States was still a kind of semi-republic, but after September 11th, it became the spearhead of this empire. Now, for the record, some of you will remember that Mr. LaRouche made a prophetic webcast on the 3rd of January 2001, 3 weeks before the Bush Jr. administration came into office, where he said that this administration would be confronted with so many problems in the financial system that they would go for a Reichstagsfeier. This was exactly 9 months before September 11th occurred. And you all remember what happened with the September 11th, what kind of hysteria gripped the population with the yellow ribbons, the over and over TV showings of the planes flying into the World Trade Center and all the other pictures. And that was used then to implement the Patriots Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, the total extension of the NSA to spy on the whole world population, violating the human rights of practically every citizen on this planet. And what happened was then more and more by Bush and later by President Obama, government by degree, eliminating the separation of the three powers of government. Under the 9/11 was also then declared the war against Afghanistan, evoking Article 5 of NATO. And then, if you think what really has come to the surface, and we will hear more about this today, what really was September 11? It was exactly what will be revealed when finally the 28 pages, which have been hidden and not have been classified in the original 9/11 Commission report, and we will hear about that later from messages from Walter Jones and Terry Strada, that, basically there is a strong reason to assume that it was conducted by the British and the Saudis having their hand in that. Then, if you look what happened after 13 years of war in Afghanistan, you have now in Afghanistan 40 times the opium production of before that war. You have between Iraq and Afghanistan 120,000 traumatized soldiers whose life has been destroyed. In Afghanistan, the training of the so-called security forces looks more like a mafia, which is already now with still US and NATO soldiers there terrorizing the population. Then in 2003, you had the second Iraq war, which, as we now know, was entirely based on lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction. there was no missiles which could reach every city in the world in 45 minutes. It did happen, what was promised in both Iraq wars, to bomb that country back into the Stone Age. And all of this was based, again, on the lies of this man, because he was the author to instruct MI5 and MI6 to make the famous dossier, which then was used by Colin Powell in his unfamous UN speech. Now, some of you remember that President Bush arrived in Iraq one time in his bomber jacket and declared mission accomplished. Now, if you look what happens in Iraq today, you have the takeover of this radical split off of Al-Qaeda, a group for whom even Al-Qaeda, whose terrorism is even for Al-Qaeda too violent, who have taken over Mosul and several other cities in Iraq. And this is, according to various articles in the British press, means the old partition of the Middle East of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which was established after World War I, is dead. It is leading already now to a redrawing of the maps. The Mosul oil is now Sunni oil belonging to the Saudis. In Mosul alone, more than 1 million people are fleeing, and the ISIS has announced that they will topple King Abdullah from Jordan. They will try to occupy the Sinai, Gaza, the Lebanon, and obviously there is the immediate danger of a full-fledged war in the entire region. And this is a security problem naturally also for Europe and the United States, because among these people are thousands of Europeans and Americans who have joined them. Now, the colored revolution against Russia and China, it already started in a way in the 70s and 80s with Project Democracy and the National Endowment for Democracy, which was founded in 1983 and funded by the International Republican Institute, the Democratic National Institute, the OSI, Open Society of George Soros, and they were proceeding to build up so-called democratic movements against governments which resisted the tendency towards globalization. It went along with the idea of a free trade system to turn the populations into cheap labor and basically organize the whole world economy to the principle of buy cheap, sell expensive, and treat many people of many countries as helots who could be treated as useless eaters, like Prince Philip is regarding them, who has announced many times that he would desire a world population to be reduced from 7 to 1 billion people, and who has been on the record to say that he wants to be reincarnated as a virus because he could help better to reduce the population. Now, this whole system has more and more led to a gap between the super rich and the poor. Recently, it was published that 85 individuals on this planet own as much as 3.5 billion people. Now, this then was escalated naturally after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the same forces proceeded to build up civil societies, as they call it, in Central and Eastern Europe. And basically, while the main funding came from US institutions, the concepts and the strategy really originates in British universities, especially Oxford and Cambridge, who are the intellectual headquarter of the British Empire. While Cambridge was more in charge of the technology side, things to do with the information age, the internet, the social media, the spy apparatus, the GCHQ, which is the equivalent of the NSA in Great Britain. Oxford was more the operational side. And they basically were the base of operation already at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century for Cecil Rhodes, who had quite sinister plans for the Third World. They were the origin of the Round Table. They selected Rhodes scholars around the world. And the main aim of this was to reconquer the US former colony after they had not succeeded to undo the American Revolution by military means in the War of 1812 and the Civil War. They decided to subvert the American establishment to adopt the model of the British Empire as their own, to create a world empire based on the Anglo-American special relationships. Who wants to look into this, read the book by H.G. Wells from 1928, The Open Conspiracy. Now, one mentor coming out of this was William Yandell Elliott, who was the professor and mentor of such people as MacGeorge Bundy, Sir Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington, and naturally they again have another new generation where you have the interventionists around Susan Rice and others. Now, the Oxford project, where this whole thing came from, was called Civil Resistance and Power Politics, led by Sir Adam Roberts, and who was one of Susan Rice's mentors, and who is one of the main advocates of liberal internationalism. And they trace themselves to the Lord Palmerston doctrine of the 19th century. Collaborator of his, Sir Adam Roberts, and Timothy Garton Ash, they conducted this project at the Oxford University, which was called the Oxford University Program on the Changing Character of War. So it was the idea to build up civil resistance in terms of military strategy. And in March 2007, they had a conference at the St. Anthony College in Oxford with the title Civil Resistance and Power Politics, the experience of nonviolent action from Gandhi to the present. So they decided to develop new techniques. In the catalog of these new techniques, they say, are economic sanctions useful to support the actions of civil resistance movements? Now, one of the speakers at this conference was Michael McFaul, pictures 5 and 3. Here you have Nadia Duke from the National Endowment of Democracy and McFaul. And then another participant was Gene Sharp, picture 6, who is really the author of the Colored Revolution. He sits in the Albert Einstein Institute in Boston, Massachusetts, and is the author of a 3-volume book, The Politics of Nonviolence in Oxford. He wrote that as a dissertation already in 1968. From dictatorship to democracy, a conceptual framework for liberation, which was published in 1993. This work has been published in 40 languages, financed by Soros, and it teaches the techniques for political defiance. And he enumerates 198 tactics, from boycott to symbolism, like don't look for a theoretical underpinning. I tried to find it, but I couldn't. It's reducing everything to one word or one sentence, like a color, orange or rose, or rude gestures, or some other symbolism like a fist. And then they would supply these activists in the targeted countries with buttons, with flyers, sometimes with rock bands, with clothes, and they would basically have false references to such people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, but in reality it is basically just paid activists. Now, there is a video speech by Gene Sharp in 1990, which you can see on YouTube, where he basically says, it has no content, it's just resistance, almost in a monotone tone, but this has now spread as so-called colored revolutions to dozens of countries around the globe. Now, the IRI, the International Republican Institute, and the American, the AEI, they had training sessions, for example, in 2000 in Hungary, where they created the Serbian Colored Revolution organization Otpor, which means resistance. They were responsible for the overthrow of Milosevic. Then the NED admitted the funding of Otpor for Georgia, Ukraine, and also on YouTube you can find a video by Otpor where the present head of it in Serbia admits that they have trained activists around the globe for the Arab Spring. They take responsibility. Gene Sharp says he was also a key figure in the Tiananmen Square upheaval in 1999 in China. In the United Kingdom, in Ukraine, they have this apparatus has recruited 2,200 NGOs. They did the Orange Revolution before they did the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then what erupted in the Maidan in Kiev after Yanukovych canceled the EU association agreement in November last year was exactly that apparatus of a mixture of such NGOs financed primarily from the United States and neo-Nazis, which had an unbroken tradition with Stepan Bandera, who was one of the collaborators of the Nazis to help the Nazis to invade Ukraine in the 40s. Now, according to this concept, these militants are reinforced by mercenary types who have trained with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. They were shipped into Ukraine, and they were in large part responsible for the atrocities which were committed there. The barricades, the Molotov cocktails, the snipers which shot on both sides, both the police and the demonstrators, and who were responsible for the coup in Ukraine on the 22nd of February. Now, the present Yats government, I call him not Yatsenyuk, but Yats, because that is the name Victoria Nuland gave him, and she put him in there. This was a government based on a coup. They have now 7 members of Svoboda in their government, which is a Nazi organization. The right sector is integrated very closely with the Ukrainian army, and they are conducting presently airstrikes against their own population in Eastern Europe. And so this has all led to a situation where, now today, it may be there may be more military action after the Eastern pro-federalist forces in Ukraine downed this plane, which was an attack plane, and now basically there is a danger of a real eruption of a larger conflict between Ukraine and possibly Russia if this continues any longer. In response to all of this, the present Russian military announced a new military doctrine, which is of the highest importance. This was in the context of a Moscow Security Forum, which took place on the 23rd of May, where they declared that the use of colored revolutions is a form of warfare against Eurasia. The Russian General Vladimir Zarudnitsky, who is the head of operation of the General Staff of the Russian Army, declared that the colored revolution are a completely lawless, medieval, and disgusting form of aggressive war, a new form of a 30-year war, going in their tactics far beyond what the Nazis did. And if you look what these other colored revolutions are doing in Iraq and Syria or in East Ukraine, you can only agree to that. They are using new techniques of aggression with the geopolitical aim to destabilize countries that have an independent policy, and they are targeting, according to this general, Russia, China, the Middle and Near East, Africa, Central and South Asia. One of the Americans who participated in this conference, Anthony Cordesman from CSIS, was so impressed by the proceedings of this conference that he published a 52 report of his notes, where he basically said that that the Russian military is now regarding the Colored Revolution as a new method of US and European warfare against Russia and China, based on having minimal cost and casualties, but that this all leads to an important source of terrorism. Picture 8 and 9, please. So this is the PowerPoint presentation which was presented there. And then Defense Minister Shoigu also underlined that these protests, which supposedly come from the population, are really backed up by military means and irregular warfare. Next picture. They are being used in Serbia, Libya, Ukraine, and Venezuela, and the so-called Arab Spring, which has destabilized. Next picture. Destabilized. Picture 15, please. Destabilized the entire northern African area, and as a result of it, several African nations are absolutely about to disintegrate completely as a result of what happened in Libya, because then, the Tuareg and others fled to Mali and other countries, spreading the terrorism. Now, the Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov, also said that this is a new method of warfare conducted by the United States. It's beginning with non-military tactics of the Colored Revolution, but then basically using behind that military force, and if the potential of the upheaval is not sufficient, military force openly intervenes for regime change, as we have seen it in Ukraine or in Syria and many other places. The White Russian Defense Minister Shardolin pointed to Gene Sharp as the author of these colored revolutions, stating that these revolutions are always started from the outside of the country. General Sadnutsky from, I think, also Belarus, said that the West regards the Colored Revolution as a peaceful means of regime change, but events in the Near East and in North Africa show that the military force is an integral part of this, and if the sanctions are not sufficient, then they go into military operations. Now, obviously, this is completely lawless. It is not sticking to the Geneva Convention, which has established rules for declared war, and therefore it makes it all the more dangerous and criminal. And it is conducted also by open terrorists and private security firms, as we have seen it in Ukraine, where Blackwater and Academy mercenaries were deployed. It is very much similar to the way how John Perkins describes the toppling of governments in his famous book, The Economic Hitman, where basically different techniques are used to lure countries first into indebtedness and then use bribes. If the bribes don't function, use destabilization, and if that all doesn't function, go for military means, which Perkins describes in great detail. Now, the significance of this new Russian and Belarus military doctrine is absolutely enormous. And, the fact that you have not read about it in the New York Times doesn't mean that is not so, because if Russia says that the colored revolutions are an undeclared war of aggression, then that means we are presently in a state of war. So if you take that in addition to all the other situations in the Middle East, in the Pacific, I think people should better be scared and do something about it rather than being complacent. This all must be seen in the context of the encirclement policy of NATO and the EU against Russia and China. There has been also a change in the military doctrine of the United States and NATO, because when we had the middle-range missile crisis in the beginning of the 80s, which was the context of the creation of the Schiller Institute, you still had MAD, mutual assured destruction, which was the idea that the use of thermonuclear weapons was completely impossible because it would lead to the extinction of the entire mankind. But in the meantime, this has moved to a first strike doctrine, which is the basis of the ABM system in Eastern Europe, which has been denounced as such by the Russians. It is the basis of the prompt global strike doctrine, which is the idea that you can, with modern means, cyber war and other modern technologies, that you can somehow sneak in behind the defense lines of an opposing country and take out their second strike capability. And it is also the idea, picture 39, it is also the idea of the air-sea battle doctrine against China, 38. Now, this is the utopian conception that nuclear war is winnable. Even the critiques of this first strike doctrine, and there are some military, even in the United States, have made the point that these first strike doctrines encourage both sides to go for a first strike. Because if you wait too long, then you are, defenseless. So it's better to be the first one. Now, already 2 years ago at the Moscow Security Conference, then President Medvedev said, and also at a law forum in St. Petersburg, was warning that this policy of the Western state using the pretext of humanitarian interventions is leading to regional wars, including the use of nuclear weapons. At that same conference, then General Chief of Staff General Makarov said that Russia will not accept the continuation of the US ABM system to its third and fourth phase, because it would then give a first strike capability which would make Russia defenseless. Now, so compared to this statement of 2 years ago, the new Russian military doctrine is a very clear sharpening, because they have now confirmed what we have published since many, many years, but it is now official Russian doctrine. And if you take all of what I said into one picture, which you should, you can only come to one conclusion. We are presently on the verge of World War III, and therefore the danger of the extinction of mankind. We need urgently an international debate about this. We have to declare colored revolutions as absolutely illegitimate. We have to denounce the farce that these people go around the world militarily intervening everywhere and call that democracy, freedom, human rights, when it is in reality murder, crime, terrorism, and war of aggression. Now, if you kill somebody in an official declared war, that may be terrible and tragic, but it happens according to rules of established international conventions, like the Geneva Convention. But if you kill somebody in an undeclared war, it is murder. To instigate a war of aggression makes the person who does so a Nuremberg criminal. Now, the fact that we are already in a war, in a sort of global war, means, we are sitting on a global powder keg which has been lit in many places, in the UK, in the Middle East, in the Pacific. And then the question is, can we stop this in time, before the self-extinction of mankind? Now, the potential alternative, fortunately, is already in place. What the LaRouche movement has been working for 39 years, what Mr. Lyndon LaRouche proposed for the first time in 1975 to replace the IMF with the International Development Bank. And then, in particular, after we proposed the Eurasian Land Bridge 25 years ago, picture 40, is now on the table. The good news is that the Chinese government has put the Eurasian Land Bridge or the new Silk Road on the table. Last September, in a conference in Kazakhstan, and in the meantime, at the recent Shanghai Russian-Chinese summit, Xi Jinping and Putin not only concluded the 30-year gas deal, which was talked about a lot in the media, but they had also 46 cooperation agreements on the new Silk Road, and the fact that on the highest level, namely between the two presidents of the two countries, there is an agreement to cooperate, that gives hope that also on lower levels and regional levels, still existing tensions can be overcome. Now, while the transatlantic system is about to blow out financially, there is a gigantic dynamic of the new Silk Road developing very, very rapidly. The new Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has expressed his full intention to cooperate with Russia and China on this new Silk Road and to help to build the north-south extension of this Silk Road. Recently, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in India pledging full support for the Indian development to upgrade the railways and express highways, set up industrial parks, build many nuclear plants in India. In the meantime, Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang was in Bucharest, where he met with 16 heads of state of Central and Middle Europe and announced that China is going to build a fast train system in Eastern and Central Europe, something the EU obviously is incapable of doing. He also went to several African states and promised that China will connect all African capitals through a system of fast trains. And at the upcoming BRIC summit in July, Xi Jinping and Putin will then go on an entire tour through Latin America to engage all of Latin America in the new Silk Road World Land Bridge conception. This is the only hope to stop and reverse this war and terrorism that is now exploding in the Middle East and prevented to come into Europe, Asia, and Africa. At a Schiller conference in November 2012, which we also had called because of the increasing war danger, we presented a comprehensive plan for the Eurasian Land Bridge for the entire region between Afghanistan and the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and the Gulf. Picture 42. Now, if you look at this from the African transatlantic coast all the way through the Arab Peninsula into China, you have one big band of desert. Most of the Middle East is desert. And the only hope to have peace in this region is to have to green the desert, use aquifers, river redirections, large-scale desalination of ocean water through the peaceful use of nuclear energy, picture 44. And have the hope that Russia, China, India, Iran, some European nations who hopefully free themselves from the yoke of the EU Commission, and a changed United States work together on development being the new word for peace. There was recently a two-day conference in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, where the new Central Asian Expert Club on Eurasian Development, the director of the Center for Strategic Studies, Safarov, spoke, and also Yuri Krupnov of the supervisory board of the Russian Institute for Democracy, Migration, and Regional Development. And they presented an economic development program for the elimination of drug production in Afghanistan, a program which Viktor Ivanov had already proposed in March in Moscow, and which again was then presented in Islamabad in Pakistan for a development program for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Yuri Krupnov presented 4 key areas of such development for Afghanistan: agricultural and food processing, machinery production, transportation infrastructure, rapid construction of hydroelectric power plants along the Panjshir River, science and technology education programs. They also decided at that conference to impose preventive measures to ward off a Ukrainian scenario in the region. So this is what the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement proposed 50 years ago, starting with the so-called productive triangle for East and Western Europe, and after the Soviet Union disintegrated with the Eurasian land bridge, and which in the meantime we have enlarged into the world land bridge, picture 41. Basically, a global program for the reconstruction of the world economy, and that program is becoming a reality. This represents a very concrete perspective for all nations on this planet. The problem is the domination of the British Empire in the United States, and Mr. LaRouche has declared in the recent period many times the only way to stop World War III is the return of the United States to its constitutional character as a republic. And that may require a change of government, which we also will hear later today. Now, Mr. LaRouche has then presented a 4-point program. It is a scientific document, a basis for the legislation for the United States to adopt. Now, this is not a theoretical question, but as I said, the transatlantic financial system is about to blow. It is much, much more bankrupt than in 2008. The EZB, the European Central Bank, just implemented negative interest rate, and the head of the Hamburg Economic Institute, Straubhaar, who is a very conservative economist, declared that to be the end of capitalism. Now, what they have planned in Europe and in the United States is the so-called bail-in, the Cyprus model. But we have calculated that even if you expropriate the accounts of all the people in Europe and in the United States, a haircut for the owners of saving accounts and business accounts, this would give you only 1% of the outstanding derivative contracts. So what we are really looking at is a sudden danger of a collapse of the real economy, and it is my suspicion that this could only be managed under wartime conditions, or that's what these people hope. So therefore, Mr. LaRouche says the only hope to stop this danger is to end the empire, to end this monster which has developed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the only way to do it is to bankrupt Wall Street, declare Glass-Steagall, do it exactly as Franklin D. Roosevelt did it, and then go to a program of national banking in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, the American system of economy, and to replace that present monetarist system. Now, all of this has to be done from the perspective of the fourth point of Mr. LaRouche's conception, which is the idea of Vladimir Vernadsky, who basically defined the law of evolution in the universe, namely that the noosphere, the influence of human cognition and invention, is becoming more and more dominating over the biosphere, that the role of human cognition, of human creativity, will be more efficient in the entire universe. Now, this also sets an entire new standard for physical science. Mankind is the only species which is capable of creative reason. And it is distinct from all other beings that it was able to control fire. No animal can do that. And to increase the control over the forces of nature through a constant process of discoveries which goes along with higher and higher energy flux densities to be used in the production process. And this ability of man has led to an increase in the relative potential population density, and therefore that must be the yardstick for the physical economy, for the decision if an investment is good or bad. Pobits Kuznetsov, the late Russian scientist, several years ago announced at a scientific conference in Moscow, that Mr. LaRouche will be known for his discovery, namely to use the relative potential population density with the word La from LaRouche, in the same way like other inventors and discoverers are giving their name to their invention, like watt, ampere, and so forth. Now, the human progress is the intention of the universe. It's a physical principle, and it is the law of the universe itself. Vernadsky based himself on Nicolaus von Kues, the great thinker of the 15th century, who was the first one to discover the biogenetic law of evolution. He was the first one to distinguish between the unorganic, the organic, or biological, and the third level, creative reason. And he then also defined a fourth level, which is the creator. He said the evolution in the universe occurs in such a way that each species only is fully accentuated in its character if it participates at least in one point in the next higher species. So the evolution does not occur from below, like a Darwinian survival of the fittest, according to Kusa, but from above. The higher level rips the lower upward, almost a violent upward pulling. Therefore, one can never measure the higher domain with the yardstick of the lower. You cannot measure the biological realm with the yardstick of the unorganic. And you cannot measure the human mind with the tools of the biological sphere. Therefore, the human principle of an upward evolution, of the increase of the power of the noosphere, is the only yardstick to measure human affairs. LaRouche says in this fourth point, man is mankind's only true measure in the universe. And it is that idea which must guide the practice in physical economy. Kusa already discussed this conception in principle by saying that the Creator created the physical universe, but after he created man, man continued the creation of the physical universe as imago Dei through his vis creativa, his creative powers. The problem with the present system of empire, of globalization, of monetarism, is that it measures all mankind from the level of the organic or the unorganic, from the standpoint of money. That is why it leads to such inhuman results. What the World Land Bridge and the Silk Road is the synonym for is the conscious decision for the next phase of the upward evolution of mankind. Because only the completion of the World Land Bridge, which includes the colonization of many nations, which includes the collaboration by many nations in the manned and unmanned space travel, the colonization of the so-called near abroad in space. That is the conclusion of the World Land Bridge. Nicolaus of Kues already said in the 15th century that each human individual recapitulates the entire evolution of the universe in his mind. And when he becomes conscious about it, he can determine with absolute scientific accuracy what must be the necessary next step of discovery. This is why LaRouche, who developed this concept of the relative potential population density, which goes along with the absolute necessity of higher levels of energy flux density in the production process, has determined that mankind will only get out of this crisis if we go into a crash program for thermonuclear fusion power. Because only then can we have any hope that mankind has a future as a species in the universe, because our planet is not only a planet in itself, but we are sitting in a solar system, in a galaxy, and the challenges coming from there have to be met. So we have to get a situation where the true identity of mankind is that of a creative species. If we want to survive, we have to rid our institutions from oligarchy and empire, which have turned satanic. War can no longer be a means of conflict resolution. It therefore must be prohibited, punished, eradicated, outlawed, banned, and condemned. And we have to make an international campaign to do exactly that. The perpetrators of this war must be brought to court, and I suggest a new Nuremberg tribunal. When even the British Minister of Interior, Norman Baker, said in respect to Iraq that it was the intervention of Blair and Bush which has destroyed that country and made it open for the extremists, and that what we see now in Iraq is the legacy of Tony Blair. Now, Blair is trying right now to campaign to become the new president of the European Commission by making machinations to not have Juncker have that post. And I'm totally committed, and I call upon all of you to help that should not happen, and that Blair should have a quite different place, maybe less comfortable but secure. Whoever basically supports this person, who is a war criminal in my view, is himself, not up to moral standards. So, therefore, we have a tremendous situation, and I can only say, that having been in this movement for 40 years, the LaRouche movement, having gone through quite some unpleasant experiences, which Ramsey also knows a lot about. But nevertheless, I must say, the world is in great peril, and, I cannot give anybody the guarantee that, we will be here in a couple of weeks or days, because this is very, very dangerous. But nevertheless, I can tell you, I have never lost my profound optimism in the true character of human beings. And I believe that Leibniz was absolutely correct when he said that a great evil is also bringing forward in human beings a greater desire and power for the good. And therefore, I still, after 30 years of the Schiller Institute, I still believe now comes the Schiller time.